Hello, I am Erica, and I was with Chris for a long time. We met in college, got married shortly after, and spent 15 years together. Life with Chris was peaceful. We lived in a beautiful house, had good jobs, and shared many common interests. But something was missing in our lives, something that left an empty space in our hearts. We wanted a child desperately, consulting doctors, trying various treatments, and even considering adoption, but nothing worked out. As time passed, our inability to have children became a source of constant arguments, and our future together began to look increasingly uncertain. Then one day, everything changed. It was an ordinary Wednesday morning when I woke up feeling slightly unwell. At first, I thought it might have been something I ate, but then I realized I had missed my period. I rushed to use a pregnancy test in the bathroom, and those moments of waiting felt like an eternity. When the test showed positive, my heart started racing uncontrollably. I was pregnant, finally pregnant after all these years of trying. I knew I had to tell Chris right away. He was working in the living room. Taking a deep breath to calm my nerves, I shared the news with him. But his reaction wasn't what I had hoped for or expected. Instead of joy, he expressed concern about whether it was safe at our age. His words cut deep into my heart, as I had expected him to share my happiness. We argued briefly, but I managed to convince him that this was something to celebrate. The following months were challenging. I frequently felt ill, exhausted, and constantly drained. Still, I held on to the hope that this baby would strengthen our bond and brighten our future together. Every tiny movement I felt inside reminded me that this was all worth it. One day, I became particularly ill and fainted. Thankfully, Chris was home and rushed me to the hospital. Lying on the cold hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines, I felt more vulnerable than ever before. I could hear Chris asking the doctor if I would be all right. Dr. Richard responded with concern in his voice, telling us that I needed rest. He explained that my body was under significant stress from the pregnancy, and emphasized the importance of staying relaxed and avoiding stress. After that, I found myself in and out of the hospital frequently. During my stays, I would sometimes catch glimpses of Chris pacing the hallways, arguing with the billing department over the phone. One night, as I lay in my hospital bed, Chris came in looking exhausted. He told me he had spoken with the doctor and that I needed complete bed rest for the remainder of my pregnancy. I nodded slowly, knowing I would do whatever was necessary for our baby. Chris sat beside me and held my hand, apologizing that he couldn't help. I squeezed his hand back, assuring him that having him by my side was enough. But as days went by, Chris's visits became less frequent. Sometimes he would call or send messages saying he was busy with work, but I could feel the distance between us growing. During my extended hospital stay, feeling particularly down and homesick, I borrowed the nurse's phone to call Chris. My voice trembled as I told him it had been 3 days since his last visit. When I asked why he wasn't coming to see me, Chris admitted that it was hard for him to see me struggling. I quietly told him that I needed him now more than ever. He promised to try to come the following day, but his voice sounded distant and detached. The following day turned into 2 days after, and soon a week had passed. Feeling lonely, I confided in Nurse Melanie. She tried to comfort me, suggesting that Chris was probably just scared, saying that people often distance themselves when they can't handle difficult situations. One morning after a particularly difficult night, Dr. Richard came into my room. He carefully brought up that it was time to discuss the delivery plan. Despite his frequent absences, Chris attended the meeting where we had to make several important decisions. We sat together holding hands, listening to our options, and summoning the strength to make the right choices. As the days passed and my due date approached, I felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety, clinging to the hope that everything would be fine once our baby was born safely. Little did I know that the most challenging part of our journey still lay ahead. The first moment I held our daughter Victoria in my arms was filled with pure joy. Her tiny fingers, her soft voice, it all felt like a dream. But that dream was quickly shattered by Dr. Richard's somber news. With a deep sigh, Dr. Richard addressed us both, explaining that there were concerns about Victoria's health, with several abnormalities suggesting serious conditions. Chris's face turned pale as he asked what this meant. Dr. Richard responded in a gentle but firm voice that further tests would be needed, but we should prepare ourselves mentally. That night, as I was comforting Victoria, Chris stormed into the room with anger in his eyes. He looked at me, then at Victoria, and let out a deep sigh. With a trembling voice, he questioned why we had chosen to have a baby at our age, knowing the risks. Tears welled up in my eyes as I reminded him that we both wanted a child, that this was our dream. He nearly shouted that we should have considered termination. He blamed me, saying my selfishness had now condemned us to caring for a sick child. I was shocked and tried to reason with him, telling him she was our daughter and we needed to face this together, but his face was red with anger. He bitterly expressed his disbelief at the situation, declaring he couldn't raise a child with disabilities as this wasn't the life he had imagined. As the weight of his words sank in, cold fear filled my heart. With a trembling voice, I asked him what he wanted me to do. Chris hesitated for a moment. Then he finally said he couldn't handle raising this child and couldn't stay with us anymore, turning away as he spoke. I felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. In a devastated whisper, I asked if he was really going to abandon us just because our daughter might be different. He couldn't even look me in the eyes, averting his gaze. He muttered that he just couldn't do it. My devastation turned to determination. With my voice shaking with emotion, I told him he could go wherever he wanted, but he would have no rights to Victoria from now on. Chris gave no response, instead turning his back and walking away, leaving me alone to face an uncertain future with our newborn. The first few weeks after Chris left were the most difficult. The house felt empty, the silence made my thoughts turn dark, and the reality of being a single mother weighed heavily on my shoulders. Yet every time I looked into Victoria's large, innocent eyes, a wave of determination washed over me. I was determined to give her the best life possible, no matter what it would cost me. My sister Crystal was my only saving grace during this time. She would often visit us, helping with housework and taking care of Victoria so I could rest. One night, while I was nursing Victoria, Crystal came in with 2 cups of hot chocolate. She gently suggested that it was time to think about the future, asking if I had considered looking for a new place to live. I sighed, looking around at the house filled with so many memories. I told her I had thought about it, but leaving felt too painful. Crystal took my hand gently. She said she understood, but reminded me to think about Victoria, saying that this house would always remind us of Chris and everything that happened here, suggesting that we both needed a fresh start. I knew she was right. I needed to let go of the past and focus on building a new life for Victoria and me. Finding a new home with limited savings and no job wasn't easy, but one day Crystal called me, excited. She told me she had found an incredible place, a rental house in her neighborhood that would be perfect for Victoria and me. We went to see it the next day. It was a cozy 2-bedroom place with a small backyard. Mrs. Davis, the landlady, was a kind elderly woman who lived next door. She greeted me with a warm smile, saying Crystal had spoken very highly of me. She offered to rent the house to me, if I wanted it. I felt tears of gratitude welling up in my eyes. I thanked Mrs. Davis profusely and accepted her offer. The move was challenging, but we managed it with Crystal's help. As I decorated Victoria's room with toys and tiny clothes, a sense of peace washed over me. This was our home, our sanctuary. Crystal peeked through the doorway and asked how I liked it. I smiled, holding Victoria close. I told her it was perfect and that I didn't know how to thank her enough. She hugged us both tightly. She reminded me that we were family and that I wasn't alone, telling me to never forget that. As time passed, our lives gradually began to settle into a new rhythm. Morning walks with Victoria, visits to the neighborhood park, and coffee times with Crystal became our new normal. One day while Victoria and I were playing in the garden, Mrs. Davis came by with a plate of freshly baked cookies. She smiled warmly as she offered them as a gift to us both. I took a cookie with a grateful smile. When I thanked Mrs. Davis, she laughed gently. She asked me to call her Lori, saying being called Mrs. Davis by her new neighbor felt strange. As Victoria crawled around playing, Lori and I talked. She shared stories about her own children and offered advice and wisdom. I felt a sense of community and connection that had been missing from my life for so long. As days went by, the pain of the past began to fade with the support of my sister and new friends like Lori. I realized one chapter of my life had ended, and a more beautiful one was beginning. Victoria's first birthday was approaching, and I threw myself into the preparations. Lori and Crystal helped by suggesting decorations and game ideas. As the day drew closer, I found myself reflecting on the tumultuous year that had passed. My little Victoria was growing into a curious and cheerful girl, and her laughter had become my source of happiness. One afternoon, while putting Victoria down for her nap, the phone rang. The sound was loud and unexpected. The familiar voice on the other end was Dr. Richards, and anxiety immediately coursed through me. When I asked if something was wrong, his hesitation only deepened my concern. He told me I needed to come to the hospital, saying we needed to discuss Victoria. My heart felt stuck in my throat. When I asked what it was about, his voice was filled with regret. He insisted it would be better to talk in person and asked me to come to the hospital. While Crystal stayed to watch Victoria, I rushed to the hospital. The journey felt much longer than usual, and my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Dr. Richard greeted me in his office, worry visible on his usually calm face. He apologized for calling me in this way, and my anxiety continued to build. When I asked what had happened, he took a deep breath and began to speak. He revealed that a serious mistake had been discovered. Victoria's initial post-birth test results had been switched with another baby's. I felt completely confused. What did this mean? I asked him. He looked at me with eyes full of regret, explaining that Victoria was perfectly healthy with no disabilities whatsoever. The weight of his words hit me hard. I said in disbelief that I had been living under false assumptions for the past year, and this mistake had destroyed my life. Dr. Richard's voice was barely a whisper as he acknowledged his responsibility, saying he couldn't imagine the pain this had caused. My thoughts turned to Chris and all the pain and sorrow this mistake had caused. I told him that my life had been thrown into chaos, and now there was no way to change the past. I needed time to process this, time to accept this new reality. During the drive home, I felt a mixture of relief and anger, but seeing Victoria's happy face as she toddled around calmed my heart. She was my everything, and now I knew she was healthy. That evening, I sat down with Crystal and told her everything. She was afraid and asked me what I was going to do. I looked at Victoria sleeping peacefully and told her I wasn't going to do anything for now. I didn't want to tell Chris, as he had made his choice. Crystal squeezed my hand, telling me I was strong but reminding me I didn't need to handle everything alone. In the quiet of the night, I thought about our future. While the truth about Victoria's health stirred complicated emotions, one thing was clear: regardless of the past, I would protect and cherish her. Time flew by quickly. Before I knew it, Victoria was 5 and preparing to start school. My heart was filled with pride, hope, and all the natural emotions of a mother. A few days before school started, during breakfast, Victoria looked at me with sparkling eyes and asked if she would go to school like other children. I smiled warmly and told her yes, it would start in just a few days. Her face lit up as she wondered if she would make friends and if they would like her. Touched by her innocence, I reassured her. I told her she was a wonderful girl and everyone would surely come to love her. On the first day, Victoria stood at the school gates in her new uniform with a pink backpack on her shoulders, and confessed in a trembling voice that she was scared no one would talk to her. I crouched down to her eye level and told her to always be herself, assuring her that she was amazing and everyone would see that, they just needed a little time. Her small hand waved goodbye as she joined the bustling crowd of students. I watched until she disappeared from sight, my heart heavy with typical maternal worry. A few weeks later, Victoria was excited about her new friend Helen. She told me about their adventures during recess, their shared interest in drawing, and their little secrets. One day, she came bouncing home and asked if Helen could come over tomorrow. Delighted by her blossoming friendship, I happily agreed, telling her I was looking forward to meeting her new friend. That afternoon, my house was filled with the laughter of my daughter's friend. I watched them from the corner of my eye, their innocent connection reminding me of how pure and simple childhood friendships can be. As the sun began to set, a car pulled up in front of our house, and Victoria took Helen's hand to walk her to the door. To my shock, there stood Chris with a young woman, who I assumed was his new wife. Chris spoke in an icy voice, telling Helen to get inside quickly. I could see Helen tense up, her worried eyes darting between her parents and me. Helen told her father how much fun she had and that Victoria was her best friend. Chris's gaze turned cold as he told Helen that he had already told her not to play with children who were beneath her, his voice dripping with contempt. It was crystal clear who he meant. Before my wave of anger could surface, the young woman tried to intervene, gently pulling Helen's hand. She softly told Helen it was time to go home. Victoria stood close to me, her eyes filled with confusion and pain. As the car drove away, she whispered, asking me why that man had said such things. I pulled her close and explained that sometimes people say unkind things, but she should never forget that she's wonderful just as she is. That night, as I tucked Victoria into bed, I made a silent vow to protect her from the world's cruelty, no matter what it took. A few days later, my phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. After hesitating, I answered and heard a woman's clear voice. She introduced herself as Melinda, Helen's mother, and apologized for the sudden call, asking if we could talk. Though surprised, I cautiously responded, asking what she wanted. She hesitated before suggesting we meet in person tomorrow at a cafe near my house. After a moment's consideration, I agreed to meet her at 10 a.m. the next morning. The next morning, I met Melinda at the cafe. Her pristine, perfect appearance seemed out of place in the cafe's relaxed atmosphere. As I approached, she stood up and offered a polite but slightly forced smile. She thanked me for coming and searched my eyes intently. She confessed that after the recent incident, she suspected there was more to the story than Chris had told her, and asked me to tell her what had happened in the past. I took a deep breath and told her that while I had no intention of spreading old stories, she deserved to know the truth since Helen was involved. For the next hour, I shared our history with her, telling her about our struggles with infertility, the unexpected pregnancy, Chris's indifference, the misdiagnosis, how he abandoned us, and our life afterward with Victoria. Melinda's shoulders slumped as she admitted that people sometimes create stories to make themselves look better and hide their guilty past. She confessed feeling foolish, saying she had believed their love was real, but now saw that Chris had simply replaced one life with another. I firmly said her name and told her that what mattered most was Helen and Victoria's friendship, explaining that they had formed a deep bond and I didn't want Victoria to suffer because of our past. Melinda nodded in agreement, saying children shouldn't be caught up in adult conflicts. After leaving Melinda, I felt as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time, I truly felt free from Chris's shadow. That evening, Victoria looked up at me while playing with her toys and asked if she could see Helen again. I smiled and assured her she could, reminding her that no one else could determine her future, that she would create it herself. My phone vibrated on the coffee table, interrupting my thoughts. Chris's name appeared on the screen, a name I hadn't wanted to see for so long. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. His voice was a mix of anger and desperation as he said my name and demanded if I knew what I had done. I frowned in surprise and asked what he meant. He told me that Melinda had left him, saying she wanted a divorce, that he had lost everything, and it was all because of what I had told her. I listened in disbelief. I told Chris that these were the consequences of his own choices, that I had only told the truth. There was a heavy silence before he continued, saying Melinda had told him about Victoria, that she had no disabilities and was healthy, and demanded to know why I hadn't told him. I responded that he had no right to know after walking away from us. Chris's voice softened, taking on an almost pleading tone. Chris told me he had made mistakes and now understood that, saying he wanted to be there for Victoria and me, to be a family again. I laughed in disbelief, asking if he really thought he could come back to us just because he had lost everything and was alone now. He pleaded that he had changed and begged for another chance. Anger welled up inside me. I firmly told him that Victoria and I had moved on from the past, that we were living well without him, and that we neither needed nor wanted him in our lives. He tried to speak again, but I hung up the phone. My heart was pounding, and I had to take deep breaths to calm my emotions. Victoria and I had each other, and that was all we needed. I would never let Chris's selfishness disturb our peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. That night, Crystal came over with a bottle of wine. She asked with concern if I was okay. I answered that I actually felt relieved as I watched Victoria sleeping, reflecting on how life can bring unexpected turns. A few days later, Melinda contacted me, asking if she could invite Victoria to Helen's birthday party. At the party, Melinda and I exchanged relieved smiles as we watched Helen and Victoria playing energetically with the other children. She whispered about how beautiful children's pure friendships could be. Around that time, I met Henry, a young man with dreams of writing children's books, at a library reading group. He was captivated by Victoria's honest reactions to picture books and began visiting our home regularly. Henry would create stories with Victoria, drawing inspiration from her imagination. One day, while walking with Melinda in the neighborhood park, we happened to pass by Chris. He looked tired and was heading toward a modest apartment building. Our eyes met briefly, but he said nothing and just walked past with his head down. Melinda softly remarked that time heals all things. Victoria was flourishing at school, showing remarkable creativity, especially during art classes. Her teacher called to let me know that Victoria's artwork had been selected for a local art exhibition. On the day of the exhibition, while taking photos in front of Victoria's artwork, I heard a familiar voice. When I turned around, I saw Ruby, my dear friend from college. She exclaimed that she had started working as an art therapist at a local elementary school. Victoria quickly warmed up to Ruby, and soon we were spending many weekends together. Henry and Ruby brought new colors to our lives. They both loved Victoria as if she were their own child, taking her on weekend picnics in the park and trips to museums. One evening, while Ruby was watching Victoria, Henry and I went out for dinner. He quietly said my name and told me that meeting Victoria and me had changed his life, and he started to ask something. Just then, my phone rang with a call from Melinda. She apologetically told me she thought I should know that Chris was moving abroad and would not return. When I hung up, Henry gently took my hand and asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, that I could finally and sincerely move forward. As time passed, Victoria turned 9 years old. One morning, she crawled into my bed and said we were living a blissful life. I agreed, telling her we had so many people who loved us. Henry and I slowly deepened our relationship, with Victoria's blessing. He moved close to our house, and we spent more holidays together as a trio. Ruby remained a dear friend and Victoria's art teacher, continuing to add color to our lives. Helen and Victoria's friendship endured, and they looked forward to attending the same middle school. Melinda and I built a supportive relationship as single mothers. That day when I received news of the misdiagnosis at the hospital changed my life dramatically. But now I understand that sometimes life's greatest trials can bring the most beautiful gifts. Our new family might not be perfect in the traditional sense. Yet we are all living authentically, cherishing one another. Victoria taught me that happiness isn't about fitting into existing molds, but creating our own path. Now, as I watch the morning sun streaming through the window, I am certain this is the beginning of our new story.